He walked into a luxury restaurant with no guards, no spotlight, just silence. But the moment the manager said, "I need your ID," everything froze. Because no one in that room knew the truth standing right in front of them. And within minutes, the entire restaurant would regret that one decision. The evening settled over the city like a velvet curtain, slow and deliberate, wrapping everything in a quiet sense of elegance. Outside, the luxury restaurant glowed like a jewel embedded in the street, its tall glass windows spilling warm golden light onto the pavement. Cars rolled in one after another, their engines soft, their presence expected. Valets moved with practiced precision, opening doors, greeting guests with polite nods, their movements almost choreographed. Every detail felt intentional, every moment curated. As the revolving door turned, faint notes of piano music drifted outward, blending with the distant hum of traffic. It was the kind of place where even the air felt expensive. Inside, the atmosphere was perfectly composed. Glasses clinked gently, cutlery brushed softly against fine porcelain, and conversations floated in low tones beneath chandeliers that hung like frozen constellations, scattering reflections across polished marble and dark wood. Everything moved in harmony, like a scene designed to be admired. At the center of it all stood the reception podium. It wasn't large, but it carried authority. This was where first impressions were made, where names were checked, where decisions, small but powerful, quietly shaped the night. Behind it stood the reception manager. Tall, composed, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, his posture straight and his expression neutral but alert. His eyes moved constantly, trained to notice the smallest details, the confidence in a guest's walk, the quality of a jacket, the subtle signals that hinted at familiarity with places like this. And for most of the evening, everything followed a predictable rhythm. Couples arrived with quiet smiles, business partners exchanged firm handshakes, and groups leaned into laughter as they approached the podium. The manager greeted each of them with the same polished tone, his voice smooth, controlled, consistent. Until the door turned again, and this time something shifted. A man stepped inside. At first glance, he didn't seem disruptive. He wasn't loud, he didn't demand attention, but there was something about him that didn't quite match the pattern the room had grown comfortable with. He wore a simple black blazer over a soft gray t-shirt, dark jeans replacing the pressed trousers most guests wore. His hair was slightly windblown, as if he had walked instead of arriving in a luxury car. For a brief moment, he paused just inside the entrance, not uncertain, but observant. His gaze moved slowly across the room, taking in the soft lighting, the quiet music, the refined elegance. But there was no anxiety in his expression, no quick glance to check if he belonged, only calm appreciation. His shoulders were relaxed, his hands resting loosely at his sides, and there was a quiet presence about him that contrasted sharply with the crisp formality around him. A few guests noticed him in passing, but just as quickly looked away, registering him as slightly underdressed, slightly out of place, but not enough to matter. Then he began walking toward the reception podium. His footsteps were soft against the carpet, almost blending into the atmosphere. The manager looked up, offering the same practiced smile he had given dozens of times that evening. But this time, the smile paused, just for a fraction of a second, so small it was almost invisible. His eyes scanned the man quickly, taking in the casual clothing, the absence of the subtle markers he associated with high-end clientele. And in that brief pause, a thought formed, unspoken but present: does he belong here? Still, the manager maintained his professionalism. "Good evening," he said smoothly. "Do you have a reservation?" The man nodded calmly. "Yes," he replied, his voice even and steady, then gave his name. Something about the way he said it lingered. For a split second, the manager felt a flicker of recognition, just enough to feel familiar, like a melody almost remembered. But it passed quickly. He looked down at the screen, scrolling through the reservation list until he found it exactly where it should be. Everything matched. And yet, he hesitated. His eyes lifted again, scanning the man one more time. The simplicity, the lack of visible status, nothing that signaled importance. And in that instant, he made a decision he would later replay in his mind again and again. "I'll just need to see some identification," he said politely. His tone remained smooth and professional, but now carried a firmness beneath it. The man's expression shifted slightly, not anger, not offense, just surprise. His eyebrows lifted a fraction, his lips parting as if to question, but he stopped. Around them, the restaurant continued its rhythm, but something subtle had changed. The air near the podium felt tighter, heavier. "It's just a standard verification step," the manager added, still polite but sharper now. The man nodded slowly, not resisting, not agreeing, just thinking. Under the chandelier light, something deeper flickered across his face, a quiet weariness, not from the evening, but from something familiar, something he had experienced before. It passed quickly, as if he chose not to hold on to it. "I see," he said gently. His gaze shifted across the room, no longer just observing beauty but noticing people, glances, energy. The manager, interpreting silence as hesitation, repeated himself, more formal, more insistent. Around them, attention grew, not obvious, but present. A couple exchanged glances, a waiter slowed his step, even the kitchen curtain parted slightly. The man stood there quietly, calm and composed, but no longer just another guest. Now he was something else. A question. And the answer had not yet been revealed. The moment stretched longer than it should have, not because the man couldn't provide what was being asked, but because the request itself carried a weight that wasn't spoken out loud. It lingered in the air between them. The manager stood a little straighter now, his fingers resting firmly on the edge of the podium as if grounding himself in authority. His posture had shifted subtly, but enough to signal that this was no longer a routine check-in. This was a line being drawn. "It's just procedure," he repeated, his smile still present but no longer warm. It had become something else now, polite on the surface, firm underneath. "We do this to maintain the experience for our guests." The words sounded reasonable, carefully chosen, but beneath them there was an unspoken message: "You're being evaluated, you don't quite fit." The man remained calm. He didn't raise his voice or react with frustration. Instead, he asked quietly, "Is there an issue with the reservation?" His tone was steady, almost gentle, clear without being defensive. But the manager didn't answer directly. Instead, he shifted his gaze past the man toward the dining room, where guests sat surrounded by candlelight and quiet luxury. It was a quick look, but it said everything. This wasn't just about policy, it was about perception. "We just like to be careful," the manager replied, his voice measured. "We have certain standards to uphold." And there it was, never said directly, but clearly understood. A nearby table fell slightly quieter. A woman paused mid-conversation, her fingers resting on her wine glass as her attention drifted toward the entrance, while a man in a tailored suit leaned back, watching with quiet curiosity. The moment was growing. The man at the podium noticed, of course he did, but he didn't turn. He didn't acknowledge the attention. He simply stood there, absorbing the weight of it without letting it change him. "I gave my name," he said softly. "And you found the reservation." It wasn't a challenge, just a reminder. A simple statement of fact. But the manager, now committed to his position, leaned further into it. "Yes," he said, "but we still need to verify." His tone had hardened. Not aggressively, but with certainty, the kind people adopt when they believe they are right even when something feels off. The man's expression shifted again, not into anger or embarrassment, but something quieter, heavier. A soft sadness settled into his eyes, barely visible unless someone was looking closely. The kind of emotion that comes from recognizing a familiar pattern. He had been here before, not this exact place, but this feeling. Still, he remained composed. Is there a reason you're asking me specifically? He asked. And that question landed. It didn't need volume or force, it simply required honesty. For a split second, the manager hesitated, because the real answer wasn't something that could be spoken aloud. It's not personal, he replied quickly. We do this for everyone. But even as he said it, it didn't sound true. The room had seen enough. People might not have heard every word, but they understood the situation, and understanding spreads quickly in places like this. The man nodded slowly. He didn't argue or push, but his silence made the moment heavier, more visible, more real. Behind the podium, another host shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to intervene. A waiter slowed near the far end of the room, glancing toward the entrance before continuing. Even the music, still soft and elegant, felt more distant, as if the room itself was listening. I'm happy to cooperate, the man said finally. I just don't understand why it's necessary. His voice remained calm, but the meaning was clear. The manager exhaled lightly, patience thinning. Without verification, he said, I can't seat you. A final line had been drawn. And if you're unable to provide that, he added, I'll have to ask you to leave. A few heads turned more openly now. The situation had shifted from a question to a decision. The man heard it, felt it, but still didn't react like most would. No frustration, no raised voice, no attempt to assert dominance. Instead, he looked down briefly at the reservation list, at the simple confirmation that he belonged. For a moment, he seemed caught between two choices, to prove himself or to walk away. Then the kitchen curtain shifted, and a chef stepped through. He moved with purpose, white jacket crisp, expression initially irritated from being pulled away mid-service. His eyes went first to the manager, silently asking what was happening. But then his gaze shifted to the man at the podium, and everything slowed. Something didn't feel right. Not the words. Not the posture. Not the energy. The chef's expression tightened slightly as he studied the scene. The man's calm stance, the manager's rigid authority, the tension quietly spreading through the room. He didn't know the full story yet, but he knew enough to sense imbalance. As the manager began explaining quickly, leaning on words like policy and verification, the chef didn't look at him. His eyes stayed on the man, observing the quiet dignity in his stillness, in the way he stood without resistance or aggression. That silence carried more weight than anything said aloud. The chef stepped closer. What's happening? He asked, his voice low but firm. And for the first time since the moment began, the balance in the room shifted. Slightly, but enough to matter. Because now, someone else was seeing it. And sometimes, that is all it takes for the truth to begin revealing itself. The chef stepped closer, his presence cutting through the tension like a quiet force that didn't need volume to be felt. The soft glow of the chandeliers reflected off his crisp white jacket, making him stand out against the warm amber tones of the room. Conversations nearby slowed. Even further, curiosity overtaking restraint as he asked again, "What's happening here?" This time, his voice carried a sharper edge. The manager straightened instantly, as if called to attention, and began explaining quickly, leaning into the safety of structured words. "Just a routine verification," he said. "The guest has a reservation, but I'm confirming identity. Standard procedure." His tone was confident, almost too confident, as if saying it firmly enough would make it unquestionably true. But the chef didn't respond right away. He didn't even look at the manager. His eyes stayed fixed on the man standing calmly at the podium, and in that stillness, something slowly, unmistakably clicked. First a flicker of recognition, then a tightening of his jaw, then a subtle lift of his brows, as if a memory had finally aligned with reality. Because the man standing there wasn't unfamiliar. He wasn't ordinary. He was Keanu Reeves. But not the version people saw on screens or at premieres. This was something quieter, more real, standing there with calm restraint, carrying a softness in his expression that hadn't disappeared even after everything. For a brief moment, the chef said nothing, as if his mind needed time to fully catch up. Then he stepped forward, positioning himself slightly between Keanu and the manager. Not aggressively, but decisively, a silent signal that something had already gone too far. "Mr. Reeves," he said softly. The name landed like a quiet bell, clear, undeniable, and instantly everything changed. Nearby conversations faded into murmurs, a fork paused mid-air, someone leaned in closer whispering in disbelief. Recognition spread like a ripple through the room. But Keanu didn't react. He didn't change his posture or try to assert himself. He simply looked at the chef and gave a small nod, calm, steady, almost relieved, like finally being seen. The chef then slowly turned toward the manager, and whatever warmth had been in his expression disappeared. "What exactly are you doing?" he asked, his voice now firm and sharp. The manager blinked, caught off guard, quickly replying, I was just verifying." "I didn't recognize," but the chef cut him off. "That's not the point." His voice didn't rise, but it cut clean, precise, controlled, impossible to ignore. A heavy silence followed, filled only by the clink of glass, the faint piano, and the subtle movements of unsettled guests. "You asked him for ID," the chef said slowly. "Why?" The question was simple, but it carried weight. The manager hesitated, the words he had relied on, policy, procedure, verification, suddenly feeling fragile. "I was just following standard steps," he said, though his confidence was fading. "We have to maintain a certain standard." "We don't do that to everyone," the chef said quietly. And that was enough. The sentence didn't shout or accuse, but it exposed everything. The manager's jaw tightened as his eyes flickered briefly toward the dining room, toward the guests, toward the image he had been trying to protect, and in that flicker, there was an admission. The chef saw it. Of course he did. And his disappointment deepened, not loud or dramatic, but heavy. Because this wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about respect. He turned back to Keanu immediately, his tone softening. "I'm very sorry," he said, "no excuses, no deflection, only acknowledgement." Keanu held his gaze for a moment. The sadness was still there in his eyes, but quieter now. "It's all right," he said gently. The words didn't erase what had happened, they simply acknowledged it. The chef nodded once, then turned back to the manager, his voice now carrying clarity rather than anger. "This isn't about knowing who he is," he said after a pause. "It's about how you treated someone you thought was nobody." The words landed heavily, defining the moment in a way nothing else had. The manager felt it immediately, in his chest, in the heat rising to his face, in the awareness of every gaze now fixed on him. He hadn't questioned Keanu because he was famous, but because he didn't look like someone important. And now that assumption was exposed, not privately, but publicly. His confidence drained slightly, replaced by something smaller, more uncertain. Meanwhile, Keanu stood quietly at the center of it all, still, composed, not triumphant or vindicated, just present. His hands relaxed at his sides, his expression steady, but the softness in his eyes remained. Because moments like this weren't about winning. They were about being seen and understood, even if it came too late. Around the room, whispers grew louder. Some guests looked uncomfortable, others intrigued, a few avoided eye contact entirely. The restaurant's polished elegance remained, but something beneath it had cracked, and everyone could feel it. The chef stepped closer to the manager one final time. "You represent this place," he said quietly. "Every decision you make at this podium defines what we are." The manager swallowed and nodded faintly but didn't speak, because there was nothing left that didn't sound hollow. After a moment, the chef turned back to Keanu. His posture softened again. Your table is ready, he said. And I'd like to personally escort you. The words carried not just hospitality, but correction, a quiet attempt to make things right. Keanu nodded once, simple and calm, and as he stepped forward, the tension in the room shifted again, not gone, but changed. Because now the story wasn't just about a mistake. It was about what came after it. And as the chef guided him forward, every eye followed, knowing the moment wasn't over yet, it was only evolving. The restaurant slowly returned to its rhythm, but it was no longer the same rhythm it had started the evening with. On the surface, everything looked perfect again. Polished tables, steady service, soft music flowing through the air like nothing had happened. Yet beneath that surface, something invisible had shifted, awareness. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but quieter than that, settling into the space like a thought that refuses to leave. At Keanu's table, candlelight flickered gently, reflecting off glass and polished cutlery. The city outside looked calm, almost detached, as if it had not witnessed anything unusual. But inside, the atmosphere carried a different weight, subtle, lingering, impossible to ignore. Keanu sat in quiet composure, his movements unhurried, neither rushing the meal nor turning the moment into something larger than it was. Just a dinner. A night that began like any other, and shifted without warning. Yet his expression carried something deeper than calm, not anger, not frustration, but understanding. The kind that comes from being misread before. Across the room, conversations resumed, but the ease had changed. People spoke, yet their attention kept drifting, toward the entrance, toward Keanu's table, toward the reception podium where the manager still stood. He hadn't moved much since the chef escorted Keanu inside. At first, he tried to resume his role, greeting guests and checking reservations, but something in his posture had changed. The confidence wasn't gone, but it had fractured. Every glance toward the table replayed the moment in fragments, the request, the pause, the silence, the chef stepping in, the name spoken aloud, Keanu Reeves. What unsettled him wasn't just recognition, but the realization of how easily he had assigned meaning to someone he didn't understand, and how natural it had felt at the time. Now it felt exposed. In the kitchen, the chef moved with precision, but his mind lingered elsewhere, on the dining room, on the entrance, on the moment that had unfolded so quietly yet changed everything in tone. Orders came in, plates went out, flames rose and settled under controlled hands, but between movements, the thought remained. He had seen many nights in this restaurant, busy ones, difficult ones, imperfect ones, but few had revealed the human layer beneath hospitality so clearly. What had happened wasn't about a name alone, it was about perception. And once perception is exposed, it is difficult to unsee. A junior staff member approached briefly between tasks. The chef didn't look up immediately. "Yes," he asked. The staff member hesitated, then spoke quietly, "People are still talking about it." The chef paused, not surprised, just aware. "Let them," he replied calmly, because he understood that moments like this don't fade instantly. They settle, they spread through silence and conversation, and sometimes they remain longer in memory than in the moment itself. Back in the dining room, guests continued their meals, but the tone had shifted. A couple leaned closer, speaking softly, not gossiping loudly, but processing what they had witnessed. Not the celebrity itself, but the interaction, the hesitation, the quiet imbalance that had unfolded at the podium. At another table, a man stared at his plate for a moment longer than necessary before continuing, as if recalibrating something inside himself. The discomfort wasn't loud, but it was real, because it didn't fit neatly into the polished environment around them. Keanu finished a portion of his meal and paused, looking out the window. City lights moved in the distance. Cars, reflections, life continuing without interruption. It was a reminder that moments like these are small in the larger flow of everything, and yet they matter, not because of fame, but because of how easily dignity can be questioned in ordinary spaces. He took a quiet breath and returned his attention to the table, still calm, still composed, but slightly more distant, not from the room itself, but from the assumption that fairness is always automatic. Experience teaches otherwise. At the reception podium, the manager continued checking reservations, his hands moving out of habit while his mind drifted back repeatedly to the same sequence of moments. He tried to focus on names and times, but awareness kept interrupting. Not the kind that comes from instruction, but the kind that arrives after consequence. He had believed he was maintaining standards, protecting the restaurant, ensuring exclusivity, but now those justifications felt thin. They didn't explain the discomfort that remained, nor the silence that followed his decisions. The chef emerged briefly from the kitchen and approached Keanu's table. "Everything all right?" he asked gently. Keanu looked up and nodded. "Yes. It's good. Thank you." A pause followed, then the chef gave a small nod and stepped back toward the kitchen. The exchange was simple, but steady, human, uncomplicated, and it left something behind in the air, a reminder of what had been restored and what had been unsettled. From that point, the restaurant carried two layers at once. The visible rhythm of service, and the quieter memory of what had happened beneath it. Plates continued to arrive and leave, glasses were refilled, conversations resumed, yet thoughts lingered in different corners of the room. What would I have done? Would I have noticed? Would I have assumed the same thing? Those questions didn't need to be spoken to exist. As the evening moved forward, Keanu finally set down his fork. The meal was nearing its end. He rested his hands calmly on the table and looked out at the city again, no rush, no expectation, only stillness. And in that stillness, the restaurant felt different than when he had first entered. Less like a stage built on appearances, and more like a mirror reflecting behavior, how quickly people form judgments, and how quietly those judgments reveal what they believe when names are unknown. Above them, the chandelier shimmered softly. The piano continued its gentle melody. The night moved forward as it always does. But something had already been marked into it, something that would not simply disappear when the last guest left, something that would remain in memory long after the lights dimmed. The restaurant had entered its final rhythm of the night, that quiet phase where energy softens, conversations thin out, and the glow of the chandeliers feels warmer than before. Plates were being cleared more gently now, voices lowered instinctively, as if the space itself was asking for calm. At Keanu Reeves' table, the candle had burned slightly lower, its flame still steady but smaller now, while the city outside the window remained alive yet distant, like a world separated by glass and silence. He finished the last part of his meal slowly, not because he was delaying, but because he wasn't rushing to leave something that had already left its mark. Around him, the restaurant continued to function, yet it felt subtly different. Not broken or disrupted, just aware, as if everyone inside had become slightly more conscious of how they moved, spoke, and looked at one another. The chef returned once more, not to check the food, but simply to stand nearby. "Everything all right?" he asked again, softer than before. Keanu looked up, calm returning fully to his expression. The earlier heaviness had not vanished completely, but it had settled into something quieter. "Yes," he said gently. "It was a good meal." The chef nodded, and for a brief moment neither of them spoke, no need for explanation, no need for further acknowledgement. Some understanding had already formed without words. Then the chef stepped back, and the night continued toward its end. At the reception podium, the manager stood in silence longer than usual as the final wave of guests began to thin. The structured rhythm of his role continued externally, greeting, confirming, guiding, but internally, something had shifted permanently. He kept replaying the moment, not the recognition itself, but what came before it, the assumption, the hesitation, the certainty he had felt when asking for identification. It no longer felt like professionalism. It felt like judgment disguised as procedure. And that realization arrived without noise, only stillness, heavy and inescapable. As the last guests prepared to leave, Keanu stood from his table. The movement was simple, unremarkable. He adjusted his blazer lightly, preparing to step back into the night the same way he had entered it. But now the room noticed differently. Not because he demanded attention, but because the room understood. A few guests glanced up as he moved toward the exit, some recognizing him now, others only recognizing the quiet dignity he carried through the space. There was no spectacle, only presence. At the reception, he paused briefly, and the manager saw him approaching. For a moment, time felt slower again, not tense like before, but reflective, the kind of silence that forces honesty. Keanu stopped near the podium but didn't speak immediately, and neither did the manager, because both understood that the conversation was no longer about verification or policy or misunderstanding. It was about what had already been revealed. The manager swallowed, his voice quieter than before. "I'm sorry," he said. It wasn't rehearsed or formal. It came slowly, as if each word had to be chosen carefully, knowing it couldn't undo the moment. Keanu looked at him. Not with anger or superiority, but with calm recognition, and after a brief pause, he nodded. A simple gesture, not approval or dismissal, just acknowledgement that the words had been heard. No performance followed, no speech, no correction, because sometimes understanding doesn't need expansion, it only needs acceptance. Keanu turned toward the exit, then paused for just a second, not to add weight, but to release it. His expression stayed steady, but softer now, not as forgiveness expressed loudly, but as understanding settled quietly. Then he stepped forward and walked out. The door closed behind him with a soft final sound that blended into the restaurant's fading atmosphere, and just like that, he was gone. But what remained wasn't the presence of a celebrity. It was the memory of a moment where assumption had spoken louder than awareness. The manager stood still long after the last guests left, long after chairs were turned, long after the lights dimmed. The restaurant emptied into silence while staff moved through closing routines, the chef working quietly in the background, resetting, cleaning, reflecting. No celebration, no drama, just stillness. Outside, the night air remained cool and still, the city continuing without pause, indifferent to the lesson that had unfolded behind glass walls. Yet for those who were there, it stayed, not as gossip, not as a story about fame, but as something heavier. A reminder that dignity is never revealed by appearance, and respect should never depend on recognition. Because the real measure of people is never how they treat those they admire, but how they treat those they assume are nobody. And inside that restaurant, beneath chandeliers that still glowed softly, within a space designed for perfection, a quieter truth had been learned, one that would not fade easily, and would remain long after the night itself had ended.